What's the best way to attach a bull blank to the lathe? Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I'm going to show you 3 ways to attach a wood bowl blank to your lathe. We're going to go into great detail and I'll show you exactly how to do each one of these steps, and afterwards I'm going to explain all the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these methods so you can choose which one's best for you. But before we dig into the 3 different methods, let's talk about the process of making a bowl and how the initial attachment plays into that. Alright, so our ultimate goal by taking a bowl blank and putting it on the lathe is to get it into a condition where we can have a really secure tenon or recessed mortise to attach it to a chuck. Once we have a tenon established or a mortise established on a bowl blank, we're going to be able to have a really good control grip of that bowl and finish our turning using the chuck. But before we get to the chuck, we've got just a raw piece of wood. So we have to make an initial attachment to the lathe. And that's what we're going to deal with today. Once we make that attachment, then we can come up on the back side of this bowl blank, shape a tenon or a mortise, but in this case it's a tenon. And that gives us also the opportunity at the same time to go ahead and shape the outside curve of that bowl. So we can do all of these steps in the initial mounted position. Now, let's talk about the first way we're going to mount a bowl blank to the lathe. Okay, the first method we're going to talk about for attaching a bowl blank to the lathe is by using a screw chuck. Now, this is a 4-jaw chuck that has a screw chuck option. This insert seats inside the center of this 4-jaw chuck, and when the jaws are locked down, it holds it in place and keeps it perfectly centered. And what happens is we will drill a hole into our blank, and that will be attached to the screw, but where the real holding power is on the flat surface of the tops of these jaws. First thing we're going to need to do is take our blank, and we're going to have a flat surface. This blank has a flat surface. If you don't have a flat surface, or if it's irregular, you're going to need to smooth it out. You can do that with a chisel, you can do that with a grinder, you can do it with a variety of different things. If you need to go through and chisel off some high spots and level that out, you need to level that out at this point. So first thing we need to do is find our center, and the simplest way to do that, I find, is just to measure and to half everything. So this is just over 9 inches, so I'm going to go just 4.5, and then I measure from the opposite side, and again it's about the same, so we're going right here, and then I'll do 1 across the other dimension, and that's looking good. This is a little bit wider here, and it's about right there. So that's giving me a good indication of where the center of this bowl blank is. Now, the most important thing with the screw chuck is to make this hole the right size. How do we do that? Well, let's take this screw and look at it closely. What we want to do is we want the screw size to be the diameter of the shaft in the middle minus the threads. We don't want to drill a hole as wide as this whole thing, including the threads. Otherwise, there's nothing for this screw to grip onto. So I have a drill here, and the way you can check this is take your drill bit, and put it behind the screw. You should see the threads around the screw sticking out. If you see the drill instead of those threads, then your drill bit is too wide. It's better to be a little bit small than to be too big here, because if you make that hole too big, the screw is going to be loose and it won't hold on. So this drill bit will work, and the other thing we need to do is determine the length of how deep we're going to drill that. And the way you do that is you set up your screw chuck. Now, also there are dedicated screw chucks. If this is a method that you want to use and you enjoy, there are dedicated screw chucks that aren't part of a 4-jaw set like this. That's all they are, is a screw chuck, and that might be something that you want to use for your turning. But what we need to do is we need to make the depth of this hole the distance from the screw the screw protrudes from the top of these jaws. So if you look at the top of the jaws, from here up, that's what we wanted to do. And this tape marking on the screw indicates that depth right there. So I'm going to grab my drill and then we'll drill this out. The big thing here when you drill this out is you want to make sure that the drill is straight up and down, and the best way to do that is check it from one side and go to a 90-degree angle on the other side and check that it's straight up and down there too, so you're not leaning one way or the other with it. But you want to make this as straight and true as possible. And then stop right at your mark that you made with the tape. All right, so back at the lathe, we're going to work the chuck onto the headstock, and I'm going to do that by turning the hand wheel on the side of the headstock, not the chuck itself. If you turn the chuck like that, there's a good chance you can cross the threads and damage the threads either on the chuck or on the headstock, and you don't want that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the hole that we drilled and bring that up to the screw and do the same thing. I'm going to turn the hand wheel on the headstock. While I hold the bowl blank, I'm turning the hand wheel and working it down. It needs to, remember, it needs to seat perfectly flat on top of the jaws of this chuck. And there we go. Nice, good, firm, flat fit all the way around. I've got a good, secure attachment, and this blank is ready to be turned. Now, there are some people that will come up to the lathe with the lathe running and introduce that bowl blank onto the screw, thread it on really fast, and then let go. Well, obviously, that's a very dangerous or potentially dangerous situation. So I highly don't recommend doing that. If you're experienced and you've done this all of your life, and this is like a production thing perhaps that you're done and you know what you're doing, maybe, but even then it's not necessarily safe and it could be potentially dangerous. So that's how you attach a bowl blank onto a screw chuck. The second method of attaching a bowl blank that I'm going to share with you today is using a faceplate. A faceplate is a great way to make a really good secure connection, and it's a mechanical connection. We're going to be screwing into this just like we did with the screw chuck, and we're going to have a good firm grip on this. Now, faceplate also has to have a flat surface, so you're going to need to level this off one way or the other. If you have an uneven surface, use a chisel, use things of that nature, smooth that off so you've got a good attachment. We're going to do the same methods of finding the center of this bowl blank. Just going to divide my across here and mark this a couple different ways. I usually go 4 different marks here, and that gives me a really close idea of where that center is. All right. Now, when you attach this, you want to be using good quality wood screws. They could be stainless steel, that would be great. I have found that the square driver screws with a really good impact drill are the key. For the longest time, I was using Phillips screw heads with a drill driver. And if you've got a wet wood, depending on the type of wood that you're using, it can be impossible to drill into it and to pull them out. A lot of times the heads would break off because they're just, the wood would hold on to the screws so well, but the impact driver is the secret. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure you have the right size faceplate. For instance, this is pretty well balanced with this size faceplate. I don't need a faceplate this large. This would be overkill. This faceplate can be used with a much larger piece of wood. Likewise, I don't want to really use something smaller than this. So this is a really good size. So pick the right size faceplate that's balanced for the blank that you're using. And you're going to want to also make sure you have the appropriate screws for that faceplate. And 2 things you want to check. You want to make sure that the screw itself does not wiggle around inside that hole. If it's too narrow for the hole or the opening, it gives the faceplate a chance of sliding around. You want that to be relatively firm in there. And you want the screw to stick out, so you should be able to count about 7 threads. If you can count about 7 threads sticking out at the base of the faceplate, there's a good chance you're going to have a really good firm connection with the bowl blank. And what I do is I line it up and eyeball it right over the center, And once the faceplate is centered, I will start a screw. I won't tighten this all the way down. And the reason I won't tighten that is because right at the last second when that tightens, it's going to torque that faceplate and turn it, and then you're not going to be centered anymore. So what I do is start that and go about halfway with it, and then I will put another screw on the opposite side. Now this one I will go all the way in. And then I'll go back and reattach this one, tighten that one down. And then basically just work around it on opposite sides. This assures that the faceplate is seated nice and secure to the surface. And just like the other screw chuck, we're going to bring this blank with the faceplate attached to it up to the headstock, and then we're going to turn the hand crank. We're not going to turn the blank. And what we want is we want the base of this faceplate to seat firmly up against the headstock. If for some reason you have a gap or there's play in there, you can use a little rubber washer or plastic washer like I've got here. I actually have another faceplate that I have, for whatever reason it doesn't seat all the way down on the headstock, so I use that plastic washer, and honestly I just leave it on all the time and it does a really good job. You got to make sure there's no nicks or anything that would make that plastic washer out of balance. But other than that, you want to make sure that's seated nice and firmly to the headstock, and then you're set. The third method I'm going to show you for attaching a wood bowl blank to the lathe is a really simple 4-spur chuck. Now this is a direct drive chuck. What does that mean? Well, this is just a solid piece of steel that has an M2 or a Morris taper number 2 at the base of it, and it will fit inside the headstock. And we're simply going to attach the center of this blank, and we have to bring up the tailstock to apply pressure to the opposite side so that it holds it in place. Now, before I put that in there, sometimes you may see people holding this in place and pounding on it with a hammer. The only reason you would really need to do that, and first of all, if you did do that with a wooden mallet or a rubber mallet so that you're not mushrooming off the bottom of this. Otherwise, it may not fit into your headstock properly. The only reason you would want to do this is if you have a tailstock that doesn't grip the rails really well and starts sliding or working itself off. Other than that, you really don't need to be pounding on this because the pressure from the tailstock is going to apply enough force to drive these spurs into this piece. Now, this piece has already been marked in center. I've got a little hole there from when I put my template on this at the bandsaw and I cut off these corners, so I know roughly where the center is of this one. So I'm basically just going to insert that right into the chuck. So I'm going to put that hole onto the 4-spur chuck, and at the same time what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the tailstock, and I'm going to just snug up the lever there to lock that, and then I'm going to pull this in place. And then I'm going to check for the balance on this and make sure that it's where I want it. Now, the next thing you want to do is you really want to make sure your tailstock is locked. So let me show you what I do with this. The natural tendency for us humans is to pound on things and to want to smack this down into place. Well, we've got a lot of really valuable tendons and muscles and things going on in the palm of our hands, and we don't want to mess those up. One of the things you could do is you could take the butt of your bowl gouge and just tap that down to really lock it, or better yet, get yourself a wooden mallet or a rubber mallet and just tap this down lightly. You can also use that mallet to tap it up and loosen it so you're not smacking your hands into it. But you want to make sure that tailstock is good and locked. And then you're going to bring in the quill of the tailstock to hold this in place. Because we're going to be working in those jaws of the chuck up in the front, and most of the time this wood has moisture in it, which means it's wet, which means it contracts. We want to remember to continuously tighten this as we're turning. So turn a little bit, and then you may realize that this is loosened up, and go ahead and snug it up more. Just remember to continuously tighten up your tailstock as you're turning, and the spurs will continue to dig in up in the front and give you a good connection. And this is how you attach a bowl blank using a 4-spur chuck and the tailstock. All right, before we get into the advantages and disadvantages of each of these 3 methods for attaching a wood bowl blank to the lathe, do me a huge favor and click that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. I have got a ton of videos and I have many more on the way for you, so you're going to want to subscribe. Also, click that like button and leave me a comment. Let me know which of these methods you use when you turn your wood bowls. All right, so let's dive into this. The first method we talked about was the screw chuck. The screw chuck has the advantage of being pretty quick to put on the lathe, and it also has the advantage of having the back section of it completely exposed, so you can work this, you can work a tenon really easily without the tailstock in the way. Now, that being said, the screw chuck and the faceplate really should have that tailstock brought up for extra security when you first start turning. But when you start working the detail of a tenon or a recessed mortise, the screw chuck has the advantage of having this end completely exposed and accessible and easy to turn. Okay, now the disadvantages of the screw chuck. Well, the screw chuck, to me, there's a lot of extra steps. I gotta go get the drill, I gotta get the drill bit that fits right, I gotta mark the length of the drill, I gotta center it. Well, I gotta center all of the bowl blanks, so that's really not a problem, but you've gotta drill that hole and then you bring it up here. Now, where that really comes into play, and it's not such a big deal, is if you're doing production work. If you're doing production work and you've got 20 pieces, the screw chuck's really nice because you can get them on and off the lathe pretty quickly. Now, other disadvantages, if you mess up that hole size and strip out that center hole, it's almost impossible to get a good secure connection again with that using that same chuck. You may have to go to a bigger size, or you may need to use a totally different method of attaching that blank. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage. The other thing that can be a problem is that that screw, especially if the wood is wet, the wood will grip that screw, and sometimes it's really hard to get the blank off of the chuck itself. Most of the time when you're working so hard to get the chuck off or get the blank off the chuck comes off the lathe. So then you're stuck with a situation like this where with this one I can loosen up the chuck and take it off, and then I'm left with the screw that's inside there, and I need to take pliers like a vice grip and work that screw out of the hole. So that can be somewhat problematic and a little bit time consuming. Of these 3 methods, the screw chuck is the one I use the least often. Okay, the second method that we've talked about is the faceplate. Now, the faceplate is pretty quick. You've got a lot of steps though too. So after you center it, you basically just need to set the faceplate on there, make sure you eyeball it centered, and then screw it in. So it's not too many steps, but it's a really good firm attachment, and it also leaves the back of the bowl blank exposed, and you can move the tailstock out of the way and work that area. This method to me is quicker and easier than using the screw chuck, and this is actually the way that I learned how to turn, was using a faceplate, which brings up another point, is that the way you learned and the methods that you know best are most likely the best for you. Okay, so they may not be what I do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's funny how we learn different things, and we learn for different reasons. Like, for instance, I didn't realize until a long time after I had started turning that the reason I was using faceplates is my mentor that taught me how to turn had a lathe with no tailstock. So the only way that he could attach pieces to the lathe was using a faceplate. So everything I learned from him was using a faceplate. There's nothing wrong with that, but there was a reason why I learned that, and I just became used to using the faceplate, so I enjoy using the faceplate. So it's kind of funny. You need to go back and look at how you learned and why you learned. And again, there's nothing wrong with it if you have a way you're comfortable with it, but I'm really comfortable with the faceplate, and I really enjoy that. Now, one of the disadvantages of it is you got to take all those screws out, so it does take a little bit of time. And you do need to be careful when you bring it up to the headstock, because the weight of this bowl blank sometimes could be really bearing on you, and if you don't turn that hand wheel properly, you can strip the threads of these real easily. So that's something to be aware of. The other big advantage with faceplates is they're relatively inexpensive. You can have multiple faceplates for very little money, and you can use them for different things, which is great. So I really like the faceplates. Okay, so the third way of attaching a bowl blank to the lathe using the 4-spur chuck is the easiest, the quickest, and the cheapest. Basically, the cost of that little spur is very inexpensive compared to everything else. And basically, the time it takes to center it up and tighten up that tailstock, and you're ready to go. Now, another huge advantage of using the 4-spur chuck is as you turn, as for instance, this piece right here is going to be a beautiful natural edge bowl. However, I'm kind of eyeballing the different negative spaces that are here. Most likely what's going to happen when I start turning this, there's going to be one side is going to be left unturned and it's going to be unbalanced. Well, guess what? Here's the beautiful thing. I loosen that tailstock and I can make a very subtle adjustment like that, tighten it back up, and now all of a sudden everything's balanced out and I can just keep turning and I'm not wasting wood. I can't do that with the screw chuck and the faceplate. They're locked into those positions. So if I've made a mistake balancing out that bull blank initially, I've got to either detach it completely and reattach it, but it doesn't give me the flexibility that the 4-spur chuck gives me. The disadvantage of the 4-spur chuck is the fact that it's an end-to-end connection. So I'm never going to have this tailstock area completely exposed so I can work just that area without the tailstock in the way. Obviously, if I take the tailstock away, this thing's going to fall off. So we don't want to do that. The other thing, because of that, because it's an end-to-end piece, it can be relatively dangerous. It can work itself off if you aren't tightening it up, or if something is not done properly, it can come out. So it's not quite as secure as the other methods, but for versatility, it can't be beat. So the two methods that I use to attach my bowl blanks to the lathe the most are the faceplate and the 4-spur chuck. The 4-spur chuck gives me the most versatility. I use this a lot with natural edge bowls. This works great when you're turning a natural edge and you have those, you have those two wings that come up, those two high edges. Well, you want those to be balanced. If one's higher than the other, it kind of looks awkward. When you put the bowl blank in there using the 4-spur chuck, it's really easy to get in there and see that one's high or one's low, loosen up the tailstock, make an adjustment, and put it back on there. And I use the faceplate a lot when I've got a larger bowl blank, something that I know has got a good flat face to it, and I need a secure attachment because the faceplate can't be beat for a good secure attachment. So these are the two that I use. Do me a huge favor, leave me a comment below and let me know what ways or methods you use to attach your bowl blanks when you're turning bowls. All right guys, thanks for watching, and as always, happy turning.